Hello and welcome back to the Bat Catalogue, the series where I read through the Legend of Batman Eaglemoss collection in chronological order, which contains pretty much most of the greatest hits. However, I have had a few recommendations of things I might want to include. However, for this series, I do mostly just want to stick to the physical collection that I have. I am happy to extend this series after I've read through all of that and made videos on all of that, and then go back and read like the year 2, year 3 stuff, and give my thoughts on that. That will most likely be through the digital comic service DC Universe Infinite. By then, it'll probably be novel to be revisiting an early Batman because we will have worked our way all the way through his years, but I am keeping those recommendations in mind and making a little note of each. Also, we are here to review Batman Year 1 today, but I do just want to give a very quick micro review, I guess, and maybe this will be something I do if I keep checking out Elseworld series and stuff like that beyond this project. Because I was browsing DC Universe Infinite the other day, and I saw a limited series called The Batman First Night. And it's a kind of limited series we're seeing a lot of these days, one of those kinds of like harkening back to the early days of the character and making this nostalgic kind of a story. It's set in 1938 when Batman is first setting out, and he's got the purple gloves and the tall ears and stuff like that, harkening back to his original design. I don't know if it's chronologically meant to be set in the main comic universe at the minute. I don't think it is. I don't think that would make sense for the timeline or the rolling timescale thing they've got going on or whatever it is. Honestly, I don't think it's all that important. It can just be in its own universe. But yeah, if you get the chance to read it, it's a pretty fun read. It's definitely a premise read more than it is like a fantastic story of crime fighting and everything. It's more of like, oh look, we're dipping back into 1938 and we're kind of reimagining Gotham as this pre-World War II kind of boiling pot, I suppose, and how unstable geopolitics is having an effect on Gotham itself. And yeah, I don't think the villains were particularly exciting or impressive, but I do think the premise held steady throughout the entire thing, and it was a pretty good read. So there's a micro review for that. It's also another Batman setting out on his mission for the first time story, so I guess it fits in thematically with the chronology that we're attempting here. But the main reason we are here today is to review Batman Year 1, which I believe is the first of these Year 1 stories that DC set out to do. I imagine very much a kind of like, we've got decades worth of lore and no real easy on point for new readers, so let's provide an easy on point for new readers and retell the origin stories of our most famous characters. I do intend to read more of these as time goes on. Year 1 was written by Frank Miller and illustrated by David Mazzucchelli, and I gotta say, I should mention as well, I have watched the animated movie version of this story. It was years ago now, so I don't necessarily remember if there were any key differences within the stories. But the one thing I did notice immediately reading this was that the art style obviously did not translate over to the animated movie version, much like with The Dark Knight Returns. Unfortunately, when DC do their animated movies, they kind of stick to one coherent style, and the original art style of the original book is lost in translation, and I think that's a shame. Because whereas the animated art style is fine, perhaps a little generic, but the kind of thing you might expect to see from an animated Batman movie, the art style of the actual Year 1 book by David Mazzucchelli is grungy and moody, and it just fits perfectly with a story that Frank Miller wants to tell here. As I remembered from the animated movie, this definitely feels like it focuses almost more on Jim Gordon than it does on Bruce Wayne, even though we do get a sizable chunk of story from both of their viewpoints. But honestly, I think sticking mostly to Jim Gordon's perspective works wonders, because obviously while we see the things we're expecting to see from Bruce Wayne, like I shall become a bat and all that stuff, seeing him mostly through Jim Gordon's eyes really helps give us the perspective of what it must be like to just be living in Gotham around the time that Batman first sets out on his mission. Plus, Jim Gordon is just a fascinating character to explore in his own right, and I don't really know how many times the origin of Batman's story had been told by the time this comic was written in the late 80s, but it definitely feels like Frank Miller was maybe going, okay, that's been explored, but there's more to explore with Jim Gordon. I don't know. This presentation of Jim Gordon as this flawed hero who ends up cheating on his wife, but ultimately intends to be a good person and is sick of corruption in the GCPD and all that good stuff. It feels right tonally. Like, I like that he ends up resorting to the kind of foul play that the bent cops, I guess, use against him, and he has to resort to, like, roughing up one of them and leaving them naked in the snow in order to make sure that they don't harm his family. It really illustrates the kind of world that he stepped into with Gotham. And it, of course, mirrors Bruce Wayne's realization that fear is what is needed to keep criminal elements at bay in Gotham. Whether that's right or wrong, both of these characters come to the same conclusion, and I think that foreshadows their later teamwork. But the focus on Jim Gordon's character arc here doesn't necessarily overshadow Bruce Wayne's journey either. We see him make so many mistakes in this story, which I think is really great. He's not just flawless as Batman from the outset, which I think is something that other books maybe, get wrong sometimes. Like, early Batman should make a few more mistakes, and he's not going up against any supervillains in this issue either. I think or this book, sorry, I guess I should say. I think that's something that's really cool about this story. It's not, oh, and he's facing off against the Riddler like in Zero Year, or the Joker has shown up. It's more human than that. It feels right that Batman's first encounters fighting crime should be crime as we recognize it, like street thugs and stuff like that. I must admit, I did raise my eyebrows a little bit at how quickly he recovered from getting shot in the legs. I think the time frame given was like a week or two, but at a certain point you have to recognize that this is a comic book story and some amount of suspension of disbelief is required. But yeah, the GCPD are mostly positioned as the antagonist of this story, at least the corrupt elements of the GCPD, which is most people except Gordon and the officer that he cheats on his wife with, whose name I've temporarily forgotten. I'm trying not to compare and contrast this too much to Zero Year, because this is very much two different eras of comics, and they are very much trying to do different things while also trying to do kind of the same thing, I suppose. But I think there are stark contrasts between these two stories, and I think both are great stories. I think they both do things really well in their own way, and I think if I'm going to find something to praise Zero Year for that I didn't really find in Year 1, it's giving Alfred some good characterization. We barely really see Alfred in Year 1. We see him being disapproving of Bruce Wayne, but we don't really see the relationship between the two of them and how Alfred adapts to Bruce Wayne's, frankly, kind of insane mission that he sets out on. And I wonder if that's kind of like a more modern thing. Like, I wonder if humanizing Alfred as a butler and servant is more of like a recent decades thing compared to some of these older comics. Or again, it could just be Frank Miller didn't want to concentrate on that aspect of early Bruce Wayne's story. One thing I really did like about this book is that it is set in the 80s because it was written in the 80s. It's not really set there, it's set in modern times, and those were the modern times. And something I'm realizing as we dive further and further into the modern age is that Batman is more and more technologically oriented, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it does read more sci-fi, I suppose. And back then, when you just wanted to set a Batman story in the present day and not focus on these big world-ending threats or these supervillains, it felt a lot more grounded in reality, if you know what I mean. And I don't know, just seeing like the chunky box cars driving around and telephoning people from your car door and stuff like that. It made me warm and fuzzy. I was born in 95, so around 8 years after this graphic novel actually came out, but I am just barely old enough to remember the pre-internet age and the pre-technology is in our pockets age, and I can be a little nostalgic for that, and this did tickle that nostalgia, even though that is not something that the author intended to do when they set out to write this novel, because they wrote it in the time that I am nostalgic about. It's really interesting how stories can age well in that kind of way. Now, I am reading the Legend of Batman book version of Batman Year One, and that included an issue of Batman Chronicles, issue 19. And honestly, I think it only included it for one story, because it's kind of like an anthology kind of thing of like there's 3 different stories within this one issue. And one of them was the 4th day of being Batman, and it showcases how Bruce Wayne has a romance with this woman that he is having trouble keeping up with because of his, obviously, time as Batman. He has to go out and fight crime, and at one point his face gets burned when he's trying to stop a villain with a jetpack of some variety. I don't know how well it melds with Year One, but I do think it is also a fun early Batman story. My read on the Year One version of Bruce Wayne wasn't as someone who would get entangled in a relationship, but this was a relationship that was presented to be a real one that he was actually trying to be present for, which strikes me more as a Spider-Man plotline than a Batman plotline, but we're in the late 90s now, and I guess the tone is changing. And I think it was a fun story to explore as well, because by the end of it, he actually does end up making it on time to his date at midnight. He beats up some criminals, he leaves them tied up or whatever, and he runs off and he gets there on time, and he's happy that he's managed to balance his life as Batman and his life as Bruce Wayne. And then he gets home and Alfred shows him the news, and on the news it is shown that the rest of the street gang came back to save those tied up criminals, got into a gunfight with the police, and ended up killing a few bystanders along with like an 8-year-old girl. And Bruce is mortified by this, immediately shoulders responsibility for it, and breaks off his relationship. And I think that is actually something that could have been explored in Batman Year One. The idea that when the police bomb the tenement building that he is hiding in, does he feel some sense of responsibility for that? Because if he hadn't gone out and done his mission as Batman, then none of this would have ever happened, and the people in that tenement building would have still been alive. Obviously not his fault, the corrupt GCPD's fault for that, but that is still a kind of thing that I can imagine weighing on his mind. Again, no, it's funny, isn't it? I just said that this Chronicles of Batman story that was included felt a bit more like a Spider-Man plotline than a Batman plotline. The burden of responsibility for things that aren't actually your fault is, again, more of a Spider-Man plotline, at least in my opinion. But anyway, I don't hate that that was included. That was a fun little extra. Oh, and one more thing, since I'm reading them back to back, the whole thing in Zero Year of Jim Gordon saying he couldn't see a thing without his glasses, and therefore Bruce Wayne's secret identity was still secret. That was a callback to Year One, where pretty much the same thing happens after Bruce Wayne rescues Jim Gordon's son. Although that's actually a little bit more contrived, because the only reason he's not wearing the batsuit is because he says, I'm not going to wear the batsuit during the day. I guess because he's trying to continue that element of fear. I do wonder how early Batman would feel knowing about later Batman's Justice League escapades, his very public daytime Justice League escapades, but hey, you can't always smash those two stories together and expect them to have thematic cohesion. I very much believe that Justice League Batman and Batman are kind of two different characters, but that's an opinion for another day. I do think that the whole I can't see a thing without my glasses thing does hit harder in Year One, because we have had Jim Gordon actively working to arrest Batman for at least half of the story. And then throughout the second half, we see him slowly come to accept that Batman is a force for good, after he sees him save the old lady, and especially the cat. The cat is more prominent in Gordon's mind than the old lady, and that's, What's that about, Gordon? I mean, I like cats too. I am joking, but I guess it's because more people would go out of their way to save an old lady than save a cat in the middle of a firefight. Anyway, yeah. Brilliant book. Absolutely loved it. Year 1. Fantastic stuff. Obviously, we got the tease about the Joker right at the end there, which I realised Batman Begins pretty much, borrowed. That is something that I'm finding fun about reading these stories, is I feel like with Marvel movies, they try to straight up lift and adapt specific stories, whereas DC movies tend to more like use specific moments from stories and mix them into their own original stories that they're trying to tell. For instance, I think there's a fair few things in the latest movie, The Batman, great movie by the way, that are callbacks to or lifted from Zero Year despite telling a different story. Next up in the chronology of The Legend of Batman is a book called Prey, which collects Legends of the Dark Knight issues 11 to 15. I have absolutely no idea what will be included in that, so I'm just gonna let myself be surprised. If you wish to see the specifics of the Bat Catalogue, by the way, as we're calling it, I do have a link to the spreadsheet in the description below, alongside all of the books that people have already recommended to me. But yes, Batman Prey looks to be a story from 1990, so looks like we'll be sticking to this kind of Batman era, so join me back here for when I read through and review that. Subscribe if you would like to join us on our mission through the Bat Catalogue. We've got our own mission. I've been using that word a lot today. Or if you would just like more reviews of books, graphic novels, movies, that kind of thing. I mentioned at the end of the last video that I am still reading through The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I'm about 2/3 of the way through that now, so review forthcoming. Stay tuned, and I will catch you in whichever of those comes next.